They brought him home, but left the war inside him. When Major Charles Rain steps off the plane, he's greeted with parades, cheers, and hollow smiles. But behind the medals and American flags lies something darker. 7 years of brutal captivity in a North Vietnamese prison camp. And Rolling Thunder isn't just a revenge film, it's a ticking bomb of trauma, justice, and the quiet madness that America refused to see in its returning soldiers. Directed by John Flynn and written by Paul Schrader and Haywood Gould, Rolling Thunder emerged in 1977 as something far more disturbing than your typical 70 seconds action thriller. It was raw, restrained, and unflinchingly violent. Audiences came for a hero's comeback, but were instead handed a meditation on broken masculinity and the institutional indifference toward war veterans. The film's unpolished grit and clinical brutality weren't mistakes, they were scars. Rolling Thunder became a cult favorite, passed around like forbidden material. Censors wanted parts of it buried. Critics didn't know what to make of it, and Tarantino would later revere it as one of the greatest action films ever made, even naming his distribution company Rolling Thunder Pictures in its honor. But Rolling Thunder also holds secrets, lost edits, studio compromises, banned cuts, and performances that crossed the line between acting and something far more personal. This wasn't just a film, it was a wound filmed in real time. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about Rolling Thunder. Fact 1. The studio tried to bury the original ending. Before a single frame hit theaters, Rolling Thunder had already lost part of its soul. The original cut ended with a slow, haunting aftermath. Major Rain sitting in eerie silence after the bloodbath, surrounded not by triumph, but emptiness. The audience was meant to feel the cost, not the catharsis. But 20th Century Fox executives hated it. They feared the ending was too European, too bleak, too honest. It didn't give the revenge high audiences expected. They demanded it be re-edited, faster pacing, a sharper climax, less time for reflection. The original final minutes were quietly replaced before release. Even some members of the crew didn't realize the change had happened until premiere night. That lost ending, according to screenwriter Haywood Gould, wasn't just depressing, it was accusatory. It suggested that even when vengeance is complete, trauma doesn't leave. Fox wanted action. Schrader and Flynn wanted a reckoning. Guess who won? To this day, the original ending remains unreleased, sealed in the studio vaults, or perhaps gone entirely. The irony? The final cut became iconic, but the filmmakers never considered it finished. Fact 2. Tommy Lee Jones improvised his chilling final line. It's just one line, one cold, deadpan sentence delivered with surgical precision. But it might be the most unnerving moment in the entire film. When Devane's character asks his old war buddy Johnny, played by Tommy Lee Jones, if he's ready, Jones responds, "I've been ready since I got back." No expression, no build-up, just pure, detached certainty. That line? Not in the script. Director John Flynn later revealed that Jones improvised it on set. Originally, the character had a longer response, a small speech about loyalty and justice. But Jones refused to say it. He said the speech felt fake. Instead, he stood still, looked past the camera, and delivered the line that made audiences shudder. The result was clinical, perfect, and terrifying. In a movie filled with violence, it was the silence before the storm that lingered the longest. Critics often cite that moment as Jones's breakout performance, a man who says almost nothing but reveals everything. You don't know what he did overseas. You don't need to. That one sentence tells you all you need to know. Fact 3. Paul Schrader called it his most personal film, then walked away. Before Taxi Driver, before American Gigolo, Paul Schrader poured his psyche into Rolling Thunder. The script was born from his obsession with ritualized violence and the idea that American masculinity was rotting from the inside out. In Schrader's original vision, Major Rain was more than a man, he was a vessel for post-war nihilism. The screenplay was poetic, bleak, and almost religious in its intensity. But the studio balked. They brought in Haywood Gould to tone it down, add structure, and make it more commercial. Schrader was furious. He disowned the script. In later interviews, he claimed the final film only retained about 30% of his original draft. They took out the guts, he said. What's left is just the bones. But here's the twist. Despite walking away, Schrader admitted it remained his most personal work for years. The themes, the obsession with violence, the ritual of vengeance, the loss of identity would later resurface in Taxi Driver and First Reform. So even though Rolling Thunder wasn't his film anymore, its blood ran through all the ones that followed. Fact 4. The hook hand was inspired by a real prisoner. The film's most iconic image, a metal hook replacing Major Rain's hand, is more than just a prop. It was inspired by a real man. Screenwriter Paul Schrader once recounted that during his research, he came across an article about a Vietnam veteran who had lost his hand in captivity and returned home to find his family estranged and his country apathetic. The man had replaced his missing limb with a crude metal hook, not for utility, but to remind himself and others what he'd survived. Schrader was haunted by the image. It wasn't just physical mutilation, it was symbolic. A man turned into a weapon by war, unable to reintegrate, unable to let go. The film exaggerates the idea, turning the hook into a tool of revenge. But for veterans watching in 1977, it wasn't fantasy. It was a metaphor sharpened into steel. And when Rain sharpens the tip of his hook in preparation for vengeance, it isn't just preparation, it's ritual. A soldier discarded by his country, forging his pain into purpose. Fact 5. The hotel shootout was based on a real Texas incident. The climactic final sequence, a violent shootout in a brothel/hotel, is one of the most talked about moments in Rolling Thunder. But few realize it wasn't entirely fictional. John Flynn admitted that the scene was inspired by a real event in Texas where two ex-servicemen stormed into a bar rumored to be connected to organized crime and opened fire after being refused justice through legal channels. The details were murky, but the core was clear. Soldiers trained for war, returning to a country that no longer had rules they recognized. Flynn and Schrader lifted the tone and geography of that moment and planted it into the film's climax. The setting was changed, the names were scrubbed, but the rage remained intact. The way the shootout is framed with minimal music, tight camera work, and brutal finality was deliberate. It wasn't stylized violence. It was a silent indictment. You're not supposed to cheer, you're supposed to flinch. Fact 6. The film was almost rated X because of one scene. Rolling Thunder flirted dangerously with an X rating, not for nudity or profanity, but for a scene that was, in the words of one censor, too real to be fiction. The scene in question? The home invasion where Major Rain's wife and son are assaulted and he's tortured with a garbage disposal. The violence isn't exaggerated. It's slow, methodical, and the way it's shot with stillness and unblinking frames made censors deeply uncomfortable. 20th Century Fox was warned. Unless the scene was trimmed, the MPAA would brand the film with an X, effectively killing its mainstream release. Flynn refused. Schrader fought. The studio panicked. In the end, only a few seconds were removed, tiny cuts that dulled the edge but didn't remove the blade. And those edits were so subtle that even hardcore fans debate which version they've seen. It wasn't gore that earned the threat of an X. It was truth. Pain without spectacle. Violence that looked like memory. Fact 7. Quentin Tarantino didn't just love the film, he tried to revive it. When Quentin Tarantino first saw Rolling Thunder, he didn't just admire it, he became obsessed. In interviews, he ranked it alongside Taxi Driver and Straw Dogs as one of the most important post-Vietnam films ever made. But his obsession didn't end with praise. In the mid-1990 seconds, Tarantino founded Rolling Thunder Pictures, a distribution label under Miramax, specifically to re-release and spotlight overlooked cult films. The label's name? An homage to this very film. Tarantino pushed to get Rolling Thunder remastered and re-released in theaters. But rights issues and studio indifference stalled the plan. Despite his influence, even he couldn't cut through the red tape. Still, the film's DNA can be found throughout Tarantino's work. The restrained violence, the quiet protagonists, the sudden bursts of brutality, and the existential rage. Rolling Thunder wasn't just one of his favorite films, it was part of his creative origin story. To this day, Tarantino fans debate which scenes from Kill Bill or Inglourious Basterds owe their structure to this forgotten thunderclap from 1977. Fact 8. William Devane wasn't the first choice for Major Rain. It's hard to imagine anyone else as Major Charles Rain, cold, distant, calculating. But William Devane wasn't the studio's first pick, or second, or even third. Initially, the role was offered to actors with more mainstream appeal. James Caan, Charles Bronson, and even Steve McQueen were floated in early conversations. All passed. Caan reportedly said the script was too dead inside. Bronson declined because he didn't want to play a victim. McQueen's reps said it was too violent. When Devane was finally cast, some at Fox objected. He wasn't a big box office name, but Flynn insisted. He said Devane had the exact emotional detachment. The role needed not stoicism, but something deeper, something broken. And he was right. Devane's performance became the soul of the film. Critics didn't call it emotional. They called it surgical, not a portrayal, but an autopsy. Fact 9. The original trailer was so disturbing, it was pulled. Few film trailers in the 70 seconds were censored after release, but Rolling Thunder became a rare exception. The original theatrical trailer leaned heavily into the film's darker themes. Grainy footage of Rain's torture, flashes of the hook hand dripping with blood, and an eerie voiceover that whispered lines from the script. They took his hand, now he's taking theirs. Audiences didn't respond well. Test screenings showed confusion and discomfort. Some viewers thought it was a horror film. Others thought it was a true crime documentary. One theater owner in Texas reportedly refused to play the trailer, saying it would drive away families. Fox reacted quickly. The trailer was pulled from most theaters and replaced with a toned-down version that emphasized action over trauma. The original cut of the trailer has since become a collector's item seldom seen, barely circulated, and still unsettling. It sold not just the film, but the pain behind it. Fact 10. The screenwriter wanted Rain to die. In Paul Schrader's original draft, Major Charles Rain wasn't supposed to survive the final shootout. In fact, his death was meant to be inevitable, a final act of self-destruction by a man who had already lost everything long before the film began. Schrader envisioned the brothel massacre as a suicide ritual, not a triumphant victory. Rain would exact his revenge, but at the cost of his own life. It was meant to mirror the kamikaze missions he'd studied while writing, where violence wasn't a choice but a moral conclusion. But the studio rejected it. Executives insisted that Rain had to live to walk out of the bloodbath stoic and intact, so audiences could leave feeling vindicated. Schrader hated the compromise, calling it Hollywood cowardice. What remains is a film that ends with the body count piled high and Rain walking into daylight. But behind that ending lies the ghost of a darker one where the final victim wasn't a criminal, but the man wielding the gun. Fact 11. The film was accused of promoting vigilantism. When Rolling Thunder was released in 1977, it didn't just spark admiration, it sparked fear. Law enforcement groups across several U.S. cities criticized the film, accusing it of glorifying vigilante justice and portraying the legal system as impotent. One police chief in Detroit even warned that this film encourages veterans to take justice into their own hands. The controversy wasn't entirely unwarranted. The movie does show a broken system, police dismissing leads, prosecutors showing indifference, and Rain's pain dismissed as bad dreams. In response, the film's characters take matters into their own hands, brutally. Flynn and Schrader both denied promoting vigilantism. They insisted the film was a character study, not a call to arms. But the message was already out there. In an era still reeling from Vietnam and Watergate, Rolling Thunder struck a raw nerve. And for some, it didn't look like fiction, it looked like prophecy. Fact 12. A deleted scene hinted that Rain had a death wish. In one version of the script, there's a quiet scene where Major Rain visits a church alone. He sits in the back pew, watching a baptism unfold. He doesn't pray. He doesn't speak. He simply stares blank, unblinking. That scene was filmed, but never included in the theatrical release. According to editor Frank Uriost, the scene was too ambiguous for test audiences. It didn't move the plot forward, but it revealed something deeper, that Rain wasn't just driven by revenge, he was drawn toward oblivion. The church wasn't sanctuary, it was a preview. In the cut footage, Devane reportedly improvised a line as he watched the child being baptized. Born clean, must be nice. It's unclear if the footage still exists. It wasn't included in the DVD or Blu-ray releases. But for those who saw early test screenings, the memory of that moment lingers. A man watching innocence, knowing it's something he'll never reclaim. Fact 13. The hook wasn't rubber and it nearly injured the cast. Most film props, especially weapons, are made of lightweight rubber or plastic, but not Major Rain's hook. According to actor William Devane, the production team initially tried several versions of a soft, detachable prosthetic, but none looked convincing on camera. The curve was too smooth, the weight too light. It flopped during action scenes. So, the prop department made a bold and risky choice. They used a real metal hook. It wasn't razor sharp, but it was heavy, cold, and unforgiving. During one take in the motel room sequence, Devane misjudged his movement and accidentally struck an extra near the collarbone. The production halted for the day, and stricter precautions were introduced. But Devane continued using the metal prop, saying, "I couldn't get into character without feeling its weight. That's not method acting, that's method arming." Fact 14. A key crew member walked off set in protest. Behind the camera, Rolling Thunder wasn't a smooth production. Midway through filming, A key assistant director walked off the set after a dispute over one scene in particular, the garbage disposal torture sequence. The crew member reportedly objected to the realism of the moment, calling it torture porn before the term existed. He believed the scene crossed a moral line, showing pain not as narrative development but as fetishistic display. Director John Flynn refused to cut or soften it. He believed the scene was essential not to shock, but to place the audience in Rain's shoes. "If you don't flinch, then you've never been afraid," he reportedly said. The walkout delayed production for a day and created lasting tension on set, but Flynn didn't budge. And decades later, the scene remains one of the most discussed and debated moments in the entire film. Fact 15. The film was used in PTSD lectures by accident. In the early 1980 seconds, a psychology professor at a university in California showed Rolling Thunder during a seminar on post-traumatic stress disorder. The screening wasn't part of the curriculum, it was a last-minute substitution when another documentary failed to arrive. But what happened next surprised everyone. Veterans in the class reportedly sat in silence after the film ended. Some cried. One left the room entirely. For them, the quiet scenes, Rain staring at walls, flinching from casual touches, speaking in monotone, felt too familiar. The professor was shocked. He later included the film as an unofficial case study in future classes, stating, "It says more about trauma than most textbooks." No one intended Rolling Thunder to be educational, but in its raw depiction of numbness, ritual, and suppressed rage, it became a psychological mirror, a fictional story that hit too close to home. Fact 16. The brothel set was reused from a Western. The gritty final showdown of Rolling Thunder takes place in a Texas brothel, a dimly lit den of vice and violence. But that brothel? It wasn't built for Rolling Thunder at all. The set had originally been constructed for a low-budget Western shot just months earlier. After that production wrapped, the building stood unused on the outskirts of a rural studio lot in Texas. John Flynn stumbled upon it during location scouting and immediately recognized its potential. With minimal redressing, switching saloon doors for stained wallpaper, swapping oil lanterns for flickering bulbs, the crew transformed the frontier town into a modern pit of despair. It saved the production thousands of dollars and added an eerie layer to the climax, a place built for gunfights, now witnessing a different kind of war. If you look closely during the final scene, you can still spot remnants of the original Western, a bullet hole in a support beam, a half-covered wanted poster. It's cinematic reincarnation by accident. Fact 17. The film's composer had never scored a thriller. Barry Dvorak, who created the minimalist and unnerving score for Rolling Thunder, was known more for pop ballads and sports themes than psychological thrillers. Before Rolling Thunder, Dvorak's most recognizable work was the theme for The Warriors and Nadia's theme, which became the iconic intro for The Young and the Restless. He was not the obvious choice for a revenge film soaked in silence and dread. But Flynn didn't want a traditional action score. He wanted restraint, atmosphere, music that suggested pressure, not explosions. Dvorak responded with something cold and unsettling. Soft drones, broken piano motifs, and long silences punctuated by ambient dissonance. The soundtrack didn't guide emotions, it resisted them. And for a film about emotional numbness, it was a perfect fit. Sometimes, the best scores aren't composed by thriller veterans. They're made by outsiders who don't follow the rules. Fact 18. A real veteran consultant quit after 1 week. To ensure authenticity, the producers brought in a former POW as a consultant during pre-production. His role was to advise on the psychological effects of captivity and the behavior of returning soldiers. But after a week, he left. According to a production assistant, the consultant grew increasingly disturbed by the script's portrayal of violence and detachment. "It's not that it's wrong," he reportedly said. "It's that it's too right, and that's the problem." He worried that audiences would miss the deeper message that Rain wasn't a hero, but a cautionary figure, that the film would be taken as an endorsement of revenge, not an autopsy of trauma. Flynn respected his decision and didn't replace him. Rolling Thunder would move forward without official military oversight. What remained was a portrait of a veteran, not as a symbol, but as a ghost still walking. Fact 19. The film was quietly banned from military bases. While Rolling Thunder was never officially censored by the US military, it faced something even more telling: silent exclusion. In the late 1970 seconds, many military bases across the US and overseas routinely screened popular films for troops, part entertainment, part morale building. But Rolling Thunder was noticeably absent from most base schedules, even after gaining cult popularity. Why? Insiders later revealed that base commanders were privately advised against screening the film. The reasoning wasn't political, it was psychological. Rolling Thunder was deemed potentially destabilizing for soldiers recently returned from Vietnam, especially those struggling with reintegration. The Department of Defense never issued a formal statement, and no written blacklist has surfaced. But theater logs from that era confirm it. While other revenge films played widely, Rolling Thunder was left out. It wasn't a ban in name, but it was a clear message. Some wounds weren't ready to be reopened. Fact 20. It sparked an unmade sequel, then disappeared. Following the film's unexpected cult success on VHS in the early 80s, producers quietly began developing a sequel titled Rolling Thunder: Aftermath. The script reportedly followed Johnny, Tommy Lee Jones, years after the brothel massacre, now living off-grid and being drawn back into violence when someone targets the family of a fellow vet. It was darker, more introspective, and aimed to explore the ripple effects of vengeance. What happens after the last bullet is fired? Jones was approached. He showed interest, but had just signed on to a string of bigger studio projects. Without him, the project lost momentum. William Devane declined altogether, believing the original film stood complete. The script was shelved. The title was abandoned. No footage was ever shot. And so, Rolling Thunder remained what it was always meant to be: a standalone wound, unhealed, unanswered, and unforgettable. Bonus fact: the film may have inspired a real crime. Years after Rolling Thunder faded from theaters, a chilling case in California caught the attention of FBI profilers, and one obscure link pointed back to the film. In 1983, a decorated Vietnam veteran was arrested after a series of violent assaults mirroring scenes from the movie. He had lost part of his hand in combat and wore a makeshift prosthetic. His journal, later found in a storage unit, detailed fantasies of revenge, justice, and taking back control the way Rain did. The journal included quotes from Rolling Thunder, direct ones, including the line, "They took his hand, now he's taking theirs." During trial, the defense argued that the man had suffered from untreated PTSD and had become obsessed with the film, using it as a psychological framework for his actions. Prosecutors dismissed the claim as a deflection. But behind closed doors, FBI analysts began debating a deeper question: could fiction sharpen trauma into motive? No charges were ever linked directly to the film, no lawsuits were filed, and the press barely connected the dots. But within a small circle of behavioral analysts, the case is still whispered about as the Rain effect. A story, written to explore the cost of violence, may have accidentally become a blueprint for it. Where does influence end and accountability begin? They called it just another revenge film. But Rolling Thunder wasn't about revenge, it was about the silence after the scream, the emptiness left behind when justice feels like a weapon. For decades, it lingered beneath the radar, too raw to celebrate, too honest to ignore. Now that you've seen what Thunder leaves in its wake, tell us, was Rolling Thunder a forgotten masterpiece of psychological reckoning or a dangerous mirror for wounded minds? And which buried film should we dig up next?